1944. The wreckage still smoked. Metal groaned in the silence as oil dripped onto the forest floor. Somewhere in occupied France, hidden beneath a tangled canopy of trees, lay the shattered remains of an American B-26 Marauder bomber. Its nose ripped open, one engine torn free, and its tail twisted like a child's toy. The pilot was dead, two crewmen badly wounded, and standing alone in the wreckage was a flight engineer named Walter Hughes, a man with no rank to command, no weapon to fight, and no way home. But in the next 6 days, this mad mechanic, stranded deep in Nazi territory, would attempt something so insane it defied logic: to rebuild the bomber, using spare parts ripped from downed German planes. No manuals, no tools, no hope of rescue, only raw ingenuity, desperation, and a mind that refused to quit. This is the true story of the engineer who rebuilt a plane in the heart of enemy land and flew it back into history. The mission had started like so many others, a bombing run over German supply lines outside Reims. Walter Hughes, a quiet, wiry man from Ohio, wasn't supposed to be there. As the flight engineer, he usually stayed behind doing routine maintenance. But that day, he volunteered. The crew was short one man, and Walter knew the B-26 inside and out. He believed in the machine. He believed, foolishly perhaps, that knowing every rivet and wire gave him a kind of control over fate. It didn't. As the bomber crossed into enemy airspace, flak lit the sky like a thunderstorm. The first hit was violent, a direct strike to the right wing. The second ripped through the cockpit. The pilot never had a chance. The plane plummeted, spiraling down in a scream of wind and steel before smashing into the dense woods below. Miraculously, 5 of the 7 crew survived the impact. 2 were unconscious. One was crying out for his mother. Walter, bloodied, ears ringing, half blind from smoke, crawled out through a jagged hole in the fuselage and collapsed in the dirt. He woke to silence, just the wind in the trees, no German boots yet, no gunfire, just the stench of fuel and the ticking sound of a dying engine. Walter's mind raced. They were miles from the front. Radio destroyed, supplies gone. If they stayed, they'd be hunted. If they ran, the wounded would never make it. And then he saw it, the B-26's mainframe, somehow intact, bent, bruised, but not broken. An idea flickered through his brain. It was madness, suicidal even. But it was the only plan that gave them a chance. He would fix it. He would rebuild the bomber, right here, right now, in the middle of the occupied France. It was an idea born not from confidence, but desperation. Walter had spent his life with machines. As a boy, he took apart radios. In the Army Air Forces, he'd rebuilt engines others threw away. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't even particularly brave. But he understood machines, their pain, their patience. Now, as he stood among broken men and broken metal, something in him snapped into focus. He wasn't thinking about awards. He wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about pressure seals, fuel lines, and torque ratios. If he could stabilize the left wing, if he could find another engine, if he could just get the hydraulics working. He knew there were German crash sites in the woods, shot down Messerschmitts and wrecked supply trucks. Maybe, just maybe, there were parts he could steal. Walter grabbed a rusted toolbox from the wreckage. The tools were few: a wrench, some pliers, a spool of copper wire. Not enough, but it would have to do. He turned to the others. Most stared back, stunned, barely breathing. One of the gunners laughed, thinking it was a joke. "You can't fix that," he muttered. "It's dead." Walter didn't respond. He just walked into the woods, alone, in search of German metal. The plan had begun. The forest was thick with shadow and silence, the kind of silence that hums with danger. Every step Walter Hughes took away from the downed bomber was a step deeper into enemy territory, deeper into a world where any snapped twig could summon a patrol, where a wrong turn meant death. He carried no weapon, just a dented toolbox and a mind filled with schematics. The map in his head wasn't of roads or villages, but of aircraft wiring, gear assemblies, and engine mounts. He wasn't hunting food or water. He was hunting parts. Rivets, panels, landing gear, anything he could scavenge from the skeletons of Nazi aircraft scattered across the woods of France like fallen vultures. The Allies had been bombing these areas for weeks, and the Luftwaffe had paid in twisted metal. Walter's only hope now lay in German wreckage. He moved at dawn, slept under leaves, and returned each night to check on his crew. Two men were fading fast. Infection was setting in. The morphine was gone. One begged to be left behind. Walter ignored him. He was building more than an escape. He was building time, dignity, hope. On the third day, he found it, the crumpled remains of a Messerschmitt Bf-109, nose buried in the earth like a corpse trying to hide. The engine cowling was intact, the throttle housing usable. He pulled pieces with trembling hands, cutting wires with scavenged blades, stripping the German fighter like a butcher. The smell of burned oil and blood was still thick inside. The pilot had never ejected. His skeletal remains still wore the black leather of the Luftwaffe. Walter paused. He looked the man in the face, or what was left of it. Maybe this had been someone's brother. A rival engineer, a mechanic, dead in a war neither of them chose. "I'm sorry," he whispered and took the man's tools. Each day blurred into the next. He returned with arms full of metal and hands torn raw. His uniform was soaked in grease and sweat. When he spoke, it was in mutters, calculations, voltages, sizes of bolts. He rewired the hydraulic system using German tubing. He replaced a shattered rudder linkage with steel pulled from an enemy transmission. The propeller blade had cracked at the root. He mended it with aluminum bracing from a downed Stuka's wing. Every piece he used had once been part of a machine meant to kill him. Now, in some cruel twist of fate, they were helping him live. The others began to believe. At first, they watched in stunned silence, convinced Walter was losing his mind. But by the fifth night, when the hydraulic doors hissed open for the first time, when the right engine housing groaned into alignment under makeshift pulleys, the men saw it. The plane was breathing again, slowly, painfully, but breathing. The dead bird was stirring. One of the gunners, still bandaged from head to waist, wept as he touched the repaired fuselage. "It's real," he whispered. "He's really doing it." But the dangers didn't stop. Twice, German patrols passed within earshot. Once, a pair of SS scouts entered the clearing, drawn by the glint of sunlight on metal. Walter hid beneath the wing, clutching a socket wrench like a pistol. The soldiers sniffed the air, spoke in clipped German, then moved on, never guessing that the plane they saw was rising again. On another night, Walter stepped on an old mine buried shallow in the mud. It clicked. He froze. The breath drained from his lungs. Sweat poured down his back. And then, nothing. A dud. He collapsed beside it, sobbing, not from fear, but from the unbearable pressure of failure brushing so close. He fought everything: exhaustion, hunger, despair. His fingers bled from stripped wires. His mind frayed from lack of sleep. One night he sat in the cockpit, staring through the cracked glass at the black forest beyond, and whispered to himself, "You're going to die out here." But then he looked down at the console, the gauges he'd rebuilt, the dials that now moved when they should, the Frankensteined heart of an American bomber with a German spine. And he clenched his jaw. Not yet, he thought, not yet. By the sixth day, the B-26 was almost whole. It looked monstrous. A patchwork of Allied design and enemy remains, a war machine stitched from rival ghosts. The right engine still refused to turn over. Walter tore it apart 3 times before realizing the German starter motor he'd rigged needed rewiring at the base. He worked through the night, by moonlight and mosquito, his breath fogging as dawn crept through the branches. And then, a cough, a hiss, a roar. The engine started. The sound shattered the forest. Birds scattered. His men came limping and crawling from cover. The bomber's engines, one American and one German, screamed together into the French sky like a declaration. The beast was alive. It was ready, but there was no guarantee it would fly. And even if it did, where would they go? Could it clear the trees? Could it climb without killing itself? Dawn was barely breaking, a sickly gray light filtering through the trees, when Walter Hughes stood at the nose of the repaired B-26 Marauder and stared into the clearing they had carved as a makeshift runway. It was a path lined with mud, fallen branches, and desperation. This was no airstrip. It was barely a dirt road, but it was all they had. The forest was too dense to clear more space, and the undergrowth was too stubborn to flatten. The plane sat there, a monster of mismatched metal, an Allied bomber with a Nazi heart, crouched like a wounded animal preparing to leap. Walter didn't speak. He didn't have to. Every man there knew what they were about to attempt was, by every measure, impossible. But the choice was simple: fly or die in the forest. And so they climbed in one by one, their bandages tight, their teeth clenched, their faith resting on one man's madness. The cockpit smelled of sweat and oil. The controls trembled under Walter's fingers as he ran the pre-start sequence. Switches clicked. Gauges flickered. Somewhere in the back, a wounded radio operator murmured a prayer. Then came the sound, the deep stuttering growl of the port engine catching fire, roaring to life, followed by the jarring cough of the starboard turbine, the one built from salvaged German parts. For a terrifying second it choked, sputtered, and whined like a dying animal. Then, with a metallic groan that echoed across the woods, it stabilized. The plane was breathing again. Walter exhaled, but he didn't feel relief, only a deeper tension. The trees loomed like prison bars. The clearing stretched maybe 400 meters, half what the B-26 normally needed to take off. The ground was uneven. Rain had softened the soil. The aircraft was overweight, and the engines, especially the hybridized one on the right, were unpredictable. If even one system failed, if a single gear snagged, if a log sat too high in the path, they would crash again, this time for good. Walter looked over at the co-pilot's empty seat. The man who once sat there had died in the crash. Now Walter would fly solo. He wasn't a pilot, he was a mechanic. But he knew every inch of this plane, how it moved, how it breathed, how it groaned when something was wrong. And right now the machine was whispering to him, "Go, throttle, brake, final check." The wounded men in the back held on to whatever they could. The engines howled as Walter released the brakes, and the bomber lurched forward, wheels churning through the mud. Trees rushed past in a blur. The left wheel caught a root, sending the plane bouncing violently. One of the crew screamed. The rudder fought him. Walter wrestled it with all the strength left in his arms. The speedometer crawled. 50, 70, 90, still not enough. The end of the clearing was rushing toward them. A wall of pine. No margin, no second chance. He slammed the throttles forward. The German engine shrieked in protest. For a heartbeat, it sounded like it would explode. Then it surged. Walter pulled the yoke. Nothing. The nose refused to lift. He pulled harder. The tires tore at the earth, kicking mud and stones like shrapnel. Then, with a groan of steel and a burst of raw, impossible lift, the bomber rose. The trees scraped the undercarriage. A branch tore away part of the makeshift landing gear, but they were in the air. The forest fell away beneath them. Cheers erupted from the back, but Walter didn't smile. Not yet. They were flying, yes, but not free. The skies over France in August 1944 were still enemy territory. German radar, Focke-Wulf interceptors, flak batteries. And their bomber was slow, scarred, and Frankenstein built from pieces of the very regime they were fleeing. Every flight control was stiff. The instruments barely spoke the truth. And fuel, God, the fuel was running low. They hadn't had enough to fully refuel. If they didn't make it to Allied lines fast, they'd crash again, this time into open farmland. He turned west, using the sun as a compass. The engines throbbed, and every vibration felt like a threat. They flew low, skimming tree lines to avoid radar. Once, a pair of German fighters passed high above them. Walter dove into a valley, skimming the treetops so closely the wings tore through branches. The bomber groaned in protest, but held. Hours passed like lifetimes. The wounded slipped in and out of consciousness. Walter hadn't blinked in minutes. He was flying on instinct now. Not like a trained pilot, but like a man fused with his machine, the way a blacksmith knows his hammer or a musician knows his keys. Then just before dusk, a shape appeared on the horizon. long and dark and dotted with tents and trucks. An Allied outpost. Walter banked toward it, flashing a desperate SOS with the surviving signal light. Anti-aircraft guns swung toward him. Troops scrambled. Then, a second later, recognition. When Walter Hughes awoke, he wasn't in the cockpit. He wasn't even in the mud. He was staring at a canvas ceiling, the scent of antiseptic and burned coffee in the air. An Allied field hospital. Outside, trucks rumbled and voices barked orders in English and French. He tried to sit up, but his body rebelled. Every joint felt broken, every muscle torn. A nurse gently pushed him back down and whispered, "Rest. You're safe now, safe." The word barely registered. He had spent 7 days in enemy territory, living on ration scraps and rage, stitching together a machine that by all logic should never have left the ground. And now he was safe. But something deeper, something he didn't understand, felt hollow. Not because they'd failed, but because what they'd done might never be understood. When word of their return spread, officers came to question him. Pilots, engineers, intelligence men, they all wanted answers. How had he managed to keep a B-26 flying? Where had the German parts come from? Was he certain no sabotage had occurred? They couldn't believe it. Not just the repair, but the very idea that someone like him, a non-commissioned mechanic with no flight record, had navigated enemy airspace and flown a half-destroyed bomber back into Allied hands. They inspected the aircraft where it sat, grounded now for good, patched with scorched camouflage panels and bullet-scarred tail fins. One British intelligence officer reportedly muttered, "It looks like it fought itself." The questions continued. The skepticism lingered. Walter explained every part he'd replaced, every jury-rigged cable, every time he had gambled his crew's lives on a hunch. He showed the wiring diagrams he'd sketched in charcoal on canvas. He pointed to the hydraulic hoses held together with melted boots and engine tape. He told them about the mine, the dead Luftwaffe pilot, the starboard engine that almost tore itself apart. Some believed him, most didn't, not fully. The official report was filed, stamped, and buried. His repairs were not reproducible under standard field conditions. His actions were labeled unconventional, improvised, and finally, inadvisable. The truth was the military didn't know what to do with a man like Walter Hughes. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He hadn't charged a machine gun nest. He hadn't led a battalion. He had fixed something, not with rank or orders, but with instinct and desperation. And yet, in doing so, he had done what no blueprint could teach and no command could predict. He had taken a wreck and turned it into a lifeline. He had turned tools into wings. But because he had done it alone, without orders, without precedent, it didn't fit into the clean narratives of war. His crew knew, though. Every man who climbed out of that plane owed his life to Walter. They told their stories, wrote letters to their families, called him the ghost mechanic and the mad angel. One gave him a brass pin shaped like a wing, torn from the wreckage. Another wept openly during debriefing, telling his commanders, "That man built a miracle with his bare hands." But the wider military machine moved on. There were new battles, new fronts. Normandy had fallen. Paris was on the edge. Walter was transferred to an airfield repair unit near Belgium. He was offered a promotion. He declined. He didn't want stripes. He wanted silence. For the remainder of the war, Walter stayed behind the lines, fixing planes others flew, rebuilding engines others broke. He never spoke of what happened in that forest unless asked. When he was discharged in 1946, he returned to Ohio and opened a small auto garage. No sign, no ads, just a wooden door and the smell of oil. Neighbors said he could fix anything: a bicycle, a tractor, a broken watch. Sometimes he would stare at an engine for hours before touching it. It was as if he could hear the machine breathing, could feel its memory beneath the bolts. Years later, one of his former crew members, a gunner named Davis, tracked him down. He found Walter beneath a Ford pickup, gray-haired and grease-covered, humming a tune. They sat on the porch for hours, drinking iced tea, the summer heat thick in the air. Davis told him how the others had done. 2 were dead, one had become a school teacher, another worked in aviation design. "They all remember you, Tosim," Davis said quietly. None of us would be here without you." Walter just nodded. He didn't seek medals. He never wrote a memoir. The war was something he carried like a scar, visible only to those who knew where to look. And though his name never made headlines, and though no textbook spoke of the day he flew a Frankenstein bomber through the heart of Nazi territory, the truth remained, like a heartbeat buried beneath steel. For 1 week in 1944, in a forest forgotten by maps, an ordinary man stared death in the face and said, "No." Decades passed. The world changed. The war faded into textbooks, its edges dulled by retellings and political debate. Men who had once crawled through mud and fire now sat in lawn chairs on quiet porches, their medals boxed away, their memories locked behind eyes that stared a little too long at nothing. Walter Hughes became one of them, a man with oil under his fingernails, not honor on his chest. He married once. It didn't last. He lived alone, content in the rhythm of repair, engines that hummed like symphonies to his practiced ear. Customers brought in their cars not just because he was good, but because they sensed something else. A depth, a steadiness, a man who understood how to take what was broken and make it live again. He never once told a customer what he'd done in the war. Not once. It wasn't humility, it was memory. A deep, private thing, wrapped in pain and pride. To Walter, what he had done wasn't heroism, it was necessity. People had depended on him, and he did what he could. That was all. He didn't see it as extraordinary, but that's what made it so. In the age of grand strategies and famous generals, Walter's story remained quiet, buried beneath the roar of more visible triumphs. Yet those who had flown with him never forgot. Every Christmas, he received letters, some from France, others from Boston, Tennessee, and Iowa, with simple words, "Thank you, still here, because of you." One day in the early spring of 1982, Walter suffered a stroke while working on a motorcycle engine. The machine had belonged to a teenager who'd said it was too far gone. Walter had simply nodded and rolled it inside. It was nearly finished when he collapsed. At the hospital, the doctor said it was massive, likely fatal, but he lingered for days, floating in and out of consciousness. When the end came, he went quietly. No last words, no final gesture. Just breath, and then none. He was buried in a modest grave, marked only by his name, birth, and death dates, and the simple line, U.S. Army Air Forces, WW2. No one knew, not the undertaker, not the cemetery clerk, that beneath that cold earth lay the man who had once flown a dying bomber, rebuilt from the bones of enemy machines across a continent at war. But his story didn't die there. In 1997, a young historian researching obscure wartime engineering feats stumbled across a declassified field report, marked anomalous aircraft recovery. Witness, Hughes W. Intrigued, she traced the document, cross-referenced crew reports, and began piecing together a story that sounded more like a legend than fact. She interviewed surviving crew members, visited the crash site in France, even located the rusted remains of the B-26 wing, still embedded in the undergrowth. Slowly, painfully, she reconstructed the impossible tale, how one man with no orders and no support had refused to surrender to physics or fear. She published the story in a military journal. It was picked up by a veterans magazine. Eventually, a television documentary featured it under the title, The Mechanic Who Flew. And there, for a brief moment, the world saw what had nearly vanished. The story of Walter Hughes, the mad engineer who had taken a shattered bird and willed it back into the sky. There was no parade, no statue, just stories. Quiet ones told in hangars and air museums, between mechanics and pilots who'd seen the limits of machinery, and of men. Because in the end, Walter's legacy wasn't in medals or headlines. It was in the machine he left behind. A symbol that even when every system fails, even when the map ends and hope bleeds out like oil in the dirt, a human being can still build something from the wreckage. Still fly. He showed the world that you don't need stars on your shoulder to lead. You don't need to be trained for greatness to rise in the moment that demands it. Courage isn't loud. It isn't flashy. Sometimes it's a man in the woods with a broken wrench and a dying crew who looks at a ruined plane and says, "I can fix this." That is what makes Walter Hughes more than a mechanic. That's what makes him a legend. Not because he asked for it, but because he never did. History is often written in sweeping strokes by generals, politicians, and the machinery of victory. But for all its thunder and glory, war is not just about movements on maps or armies in formation. It's about men like Walter Hughes, men the world doesn't see, men who are never asked to be legends, who are given no medals, no clear path, and no permission to act, and yet rise anyway. Men who, for a brief flicker of time, hold the line between life and death with nothing but grit, imagination, and will. And in that silence between gunfire, between failure and salvation, something deeper emerges, proof that human courage can still outthink the machine. Walter's story is not a story of brilliance born in privilege or status. He was not a celebrated designer in a polished lab, nor a pilot trained for heroics. He was, in every way, ordinary. A farm boy from Ohio raised on grit and grease, who spent more hours in barns than classrooms. But what he lacked in titles, he made up for in an extraordinary capacity to understand, not just machines, but the soul inside them. Where others saw broken wires and shattered frames, Walter saw function. He saw potential, and more importantly, he believed he could put it all back together. That belief, irrational, maybe even mild in its defiance, is what separates the Walter Hugheses of the world from the rest. He did not wait for orders. He did not surrender to logic. He saw a path forward where none existed. And that, more than anything, is the central truth this story reveals. Progress is often built by those who reject what's possible, the ones who stand in the smoke and ruin, and instead of breaking, begin to build. The military couldn't classify that. His superiors couldn't explain it. Because Walter's actions didn't fit into the war machine's tidy metrics. There were no manuals for what he did, no doctrine to approve it. In fact, it went against everything he had been trained to do, to follow procedure, to maintain the chain of command, to preserve the machinery for future use. And yet, by ignoring all that, he saved lives. That contradiction, that tension between control and chaos, is at the heart of all human innovation. We like to imagine that victory in war belongs to the biggest army, the best equipment, the most advanced plan, but that's only part of the truth. The other part, the part that rarely makes the history books, lives in the moments when one person steps outside of expectation, fueled by desperation, shaped by instinct, and guided by an invisible line drawn only in the heart. There's something deeply human about Walter's madness, something timeless. It reminds us that under pressure, our greatest strength, it isn't always power, but improvisation. The same impulse that taught our ancestors to create fire, to carve wheels, to cross oceans, to build bridges. That spark lit again in a forest in France inside the mind of a mechanic who refused to die quietly. He didn't fix the plane because he was told to. He fixed it because something inside him screamed that it could be done. And that scream, that stubborn hope, is the engine behind every miracle in human history. And maybe that's why his story matters now, more than ever. Because we live in an age where algorithms make decisions, where systems run our lives, where machines grow smarter and rules tighter. But what Walter did, staring at wreckage and building a way out, is something no machine could ever do. Not just because it was creative, but because it was emotional, rooted in fear, hope, loyalty, and rage. Machines don't feel the weight of lives resting on their work. Walter did, and he carried that weight into the air. What if he'd waited? What if he'd listened to fear, to doubt, to logic? 6 men would have died in a forest. A plane would have rotted in silence, and the war would have lost something unmeasurable. Proof that the human spirit can defy certainty. Walter didn't just rebuild a bomber, he rebuilt possibility. He showed what's achievable when someone refuses to accept the wreckage as final. When someone dares to build, not because it's safe, but because it must be done. And though he died with grease on his hands in little fanfare, that spark he carried, that instinct to fix, to fight, to fly, still lives. In every mechanic who refuses to give up on a ruined machine. In every engineer who stares at a problem and thinks, what if? In every human being who chooses to act when the world expects surrender. Walter Hughes may have lived in silence, but what he did roars across time. He reminds us that greatness isn't granted, it's taken, moment by moment, decision by decision, often by people no one expects. People who don't wait for help, who see brokenness not as an ending, but as a challenge. And in a world full of wreckage, that kind of person, a person like Walter, is the rarest kind of hero. Decades passed. The world changed. The war faded into textbooks, its edges dulled by retellings and political debate. Men who had once crawled through mud and fire now sat in lawn chairs on quiet porches, their medals boxed away, their memories locked behind eyes that stared a little too long at nothing. Walter Hughes became one of them, a man with oil under his fingernails, not honor on his chest. He married once. It didn't last. He lived alone, content in the rhythm of repair, engines that hummed like symphonies to his practiced ear. Customers brought in their cars not just because he was good, but because they sensed something else. A depth, a steadiness, a man who understood how to take what was broken and make it live again. He never once told a customer what he'd done in the war. Not once. It wasn't humility, it was memory. A deep, private thing, wrapped in pain and pride. To Walter, what he had done wasn't heroism, it was necessity. People had depended on him, and he did what he could. That was all. He didn't see it as extraordinary, but that's what made it so. In the age of grand strategies and famous generals, Walter's story remained quiet, buried beneath the roar of more visible triumphs. Yet those who had flown with him never forgot. Every Christmas, he received letters, some from France, others from Boston, Tennessee, and Iowa, with simple words, "Thank you, still here, because of you." One day in the early spring of 1982, Walter suffered a stroke while working on a motorcycle engine. The machine had belonged to a teenager who'd said it was too far gone. Walter had simply nodded and rolled it inside. It was nearly finished when he collapsed. At the hospital, the doctor said it was massive, likely fatal, but he lingered for days, floating in and out of consciousness. When the end came, he went quietly. No last words, no final gesture, just breath, and then none. He was buried in a modest grave, marked only by his name, birth, and death dates, and the simple line, U.S. Army Air Forces, WW2. No one knew, not the undertaker, not the cemetery clerk, that beneath that cold earth lay the man who had once flown a dying bomber, rebuilt from the bones of enemy machines across a continent at war. But his story didn't die there. In 1997, a young historian researching obscure wartime engineering feats stumbled across a declassified field report, marked anomalous aircraft recovery, witness Hughes W. Intrigued, she traced the document, cross-referenced crew reports, and began piecing together a story that sounded more like a legend than fact. She interviewed surviving crew members, visited the crash site in France, even located the rusted remains of the B-26 wing, still embedded in the undergrowth. Slowly, painfully, she reconstructed the impossible tale, how one man with no orders and no support had refused to surrender to physics or fear. She published the story in a military journal. It was picked up by a veterans magazine. Eventually, a television documentary featured it under the title, The Mechanic Who Flew. And there, for a brief moment, the world saw what had nearly vanished. The story of Walter Hughes, the mad engineer who had taken a shattered bird and willed it back into the sky. There was no parade, no statue, just stories. Quiet ones told in hangars and air museums, between mechanics and pilots who'd seen the limits of machinery, and of men. Because in the end, Walter's legacy wasn't in medals or headlines. It was in the machine he left behind. A symbol that even when every system fails, even when the map ends and hope bleeds out like oil in the dirt, a human being can still build something from the wreckage. Still fly. He showed the world that you don't need stars on your shoulder to lead. You don't need to be trained for greatness to rise in the moment that demands it. Courage isn't loud. It isn't flashy. Sometimes it's a man in the woods with a broken wrench and a dying crew who looks at a ruined plane and says, "I can fix this." That is what makes Walter Hughes more than a mechanic. That's what makes him a legend. Not because he asked for it, but because he never did. History is often written in sweeping strokes by generals, politicians, and the machinery of victory. But for all its thunder and glory, war is not just about movements on maps or armies in formation. It's about men like Walter Hughes, men the world doesn't see, men who are never asked to be legends, who are given no medals, no clear path, and no permission to act, and yet rise anyway. Men who, for a brief flicker of time, hold the line between life and death with nothing but grit, imagination, and will. And in that silence between gunfire, between failure and salvation, something deeper emerges, proof that human courage can still outthink the machine. Walter's